Hello, everyone. Namaste, and welcome to the second of this weekend's Think Differently events. So, at Tadwa, we're all about thinking differently. We try to nurture creatives and communicators who are interested in taking ancient wisdom that comes from indigenous philosophies like Hindu Dharma and looking at how we can apply them in a modern context and hopefully give ourselves a new way of looking at the world that we live in. If you haven't managed to see yesterday's event yet, then don't do it now. Stay with us for now, and then you can find a link to it via our YouTube channel. But today, I'm joined by a very special guest, and with me is Tanuja Prasad. Tanuja is an electrical engineer by training, and she has spent most of her career as a professional within the information technology world. And through that has covered sectors such as finance, not-for-profit, and entrepreneurship. But now she's involved with a brand new scientific field called complexity science. And she's looking at how to apply it to different sectors. And if, like me, you weren't really sure what complexity science was, then stay with us and we'll learn some more. So Tanuja considers her background growing up around the world as a really strong influence in her thinking, her ability to think differently, combining Eastern and Western philosophies. So we're really looking forward to speaking with her today, learning about what complexity science is, the way in which it links to different types of philosophy that we might already be familiar with, and how it can be applied to the world that we live in. So Tanuja, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Hello to everyone. Hello to your audience, I'm sure around the world.
Thank you very much. And I should say that we're sitting in two different time zones today. So it's very much an international conversation. I'm here in the UK and Tanuja is over in New York City, I believe.
Yes.
So for our viewers today, could you just give us a little bit of an introduction to what complexity science is and how they might be able to understand what it means when you talk about things such as complex adaptive systems?
Yeah. So first of all, complexity science is not complex. So let's start with that. It's a name that was attached to it. Many decades ago, the biological and ecological scientists noticed that there was a deep connectedness between actors or agents in the system. And this connectedness did not appear in the way physics, for example, or chemistry or mathematics was taught in those days. Those were the days of reductionism. That was the time when we thought the way to analyze, the way to understand a machine or a system or a whole, or even the human body, was to take it apart and understand its parts. And thus understanding its parts. And of course, you can imagine we can when we say parts, we can get smaller and smaller and smaller and go all the way down. So we thought that the further down we got, that somehow we're reaching a greater truth. And then when all of these parts came together, then magically and just somehow they created the whole. But the biologists and the ecologists noticed that there was an additional factor, and that was the network itself, the connectedness between actors that was adding a piece that was missing from the analysis and the mode of analysis that science was doing at that time. So that progressed into something called systems thinking. So the idea that the system as a whole has properties that its parts do not. And from systems thinking came complexity science, which it can be seen, some people have defined it as the mathematics of system science. So complexity science has its history, has its antecedents in things like chaos theory, quantum mechanics, and so on. Yeah. My interest in complexity science really came from my observations just growing up, living life. I saw tipping points everywhere. I saw connections everywhere, including within my own mind, in the way I thought, in the way conversations took place. And I didn't see that in my formal education, my education as an engineer, was all about taking things apart, the term being analysis. We were taught to do analysis to the highest degree of precision. Yet, and here's the irony, as an engineer, our job is to create things, is to put things together. Yet we were never formally taught how to create anything, how to put it together. So once again, the assumption being that once you've got the parts, all you've got to do is stick them together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So complexity science then takes that thinking or that concept and just to define a little bit what you brought up, we talk in complexity science in terms of actors or agents that are connected together in networks and create the whole, where the whole displays emergent properties that cannot be found at the level of the agent. Yeah. So what that says right away is that no amount of understanding or doing research on the agent can give us an understanding of the properties of the whole. And a simple example is water. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, yeah, both of which are gases. Yet water is a liquid. If we want to understand the liquid, the fluid properties of water, no amount of analyzing the properties of hydrogen and oxygen separately will give us that answer. We have to understand the whole as well, separately.
Yeah, that's very true. As a biochemist by training, you're very much speaking my language, and you're talking about water now. And of course, just for any other people who are listening who find things like water molecules fascinating, understanding how water functions, one of the main things about it is understanding how the molecules interact with each other. It's one of its key properties that make it so unique. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. I heard you on a podcast interview recently, and I really liked an analogy you used to talk a bit about where your interest in that sort of complexity science came from. And you said it was like wanting to be the six blind men experiencing the elephant all at the same time. I wondered if you could just tell our viewers a little more about that, if they're not instantly excited by talk about water molecules like I am. I just thought that was a great analogy. I wonder if you'd share it with us.
Yeah, so that story, if you will, that parable is really, as probably your listeners know as well, is a six blind man approached an elephant from different points. So one came to the trunk, another to the leg, another to the tail, and so on. And each experienced the elephant differently and assumed the elephant to be a different thing. So one thought it was a tree trunk, another thought it was a rope, and so on. Where this comes from is, we as scientists, what do? We go out there and we try to analyze something. Do we really know how these all fit together? Do we ever get to see the whole as such? And that's my point there is that I don't think we will ever get to know the whole because everything is connected. We can only but see the part that we see. And that's what we see in science as well. This progression that we are seeing is sort of putting together the person who has felt the trunk of the elephant and then the person who has felt the tail and putting it all together and trying to understand what is this thing that has a tail and a trunk and a leg and a belly. And so with complexity science, I wanted to understand, how do we get to an elephant? Or elephants, yeah, because we don't know.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Do we? We don't know. So, but that's what's exciting. I think, though, there is an additional layer that's important, and that is actually where my work comes in, and the idea of application of complexity science. So even if I am aware of a tail and a trunk and a leg, however, the way I apply it, I may only be interested in the tail aspect because that's what's relevant within the context of the work that I'm doing. even though I am aware that the tail is attached to a body that also has a trunk and a leg. Do you see? So the model with which we operate may be deliberately smaller than the whole. So getting just the idea that, oh, we're getting more and more and more and more knowledge is not necessarily better. It's how you apply it with awareness of what the boundaries of connection, the boundaries of application are, is what's relevant.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've sort of mentioned before in some of the work that you've done, you've talked about the idea of application of complexity science. But there was an interesting point. We, you and I had a chat to just prepare for this event, and you talked about the idea of complexity science helping to tackle problems, and that it was about regeneration, and that was something quite different to sustainability, and it was an important distinction to make. And I wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit and talk about why complexity science is about generation and regeneration, and why perhaps the term sustainability might be the wrong way of looking at things.
Yeah. So sustainability, although it was very well meant, right? The idea that we want to sustain the earth, but it has this impression that we're trying to sustain something, meaning we're trying to keep things the way they are. But that is not the nature of nature, and it is certainly not the nature of evolution itself. Things must change. So what is the concept? What is the framework that we can use where we can incorporate change? So you can say progression with change while keeping the system alive, system being the earth itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at it like that, we immediately must acknowledge that death or dying has to be part of that framework. And hence the idea of generation or regeneration. So life regenerates itself, but not necessarily as a copycat of the previous life. There's a piece of evolution in there. So if we think of it as a visual, life is not moving in circles. Although there is what looks like an iteration, the geometry of life seems to be the helix. So if you look at it down, the tunnel, it looks like a circle, so things are going round and round, but the evolution pulls it towards something. So it's actually a spiral or a helix that is moving forward. And now we know that's also the case with the solar system and with the Milky Way and so on. It is moving along a path. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so regeneration is the same thing. At every step, every atom and certainly every living entity is making a choice towards greater evolution, towards greater self-expression. I'd like to take a small digression here. The word evolution has become synonymous with Darwinian evolution. Yeah. And Darwinian evolution has also become synonymous with the idea of competition. That is, the fittest survive or the strongest survive. I kill you in order to survive. Yeah. And therefore I become the future of the race, of the species. Mm-hmm. But if we look at it more holistically, more in the sense of biology and ecology, we see that the formation of larger entities such as human beings did not come through the death of smaller entities. It came through the collaboration of smaller entities in hierarchies to create a more complex intent. And now we know this, that the human system has 90% bacteria or something like this.
Oh yeah, we have more bacterial cells than we do human cells.
That's right. So it isn't, so that belies Darwinian evolution. And so what we're looking at here is a networked-based collaboration, while at the same time that the whole is expressing itself as a network, or you can say as a community, but within it, each individual system, agent, cell, atom is expressing itself as itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's so tremendous about this, is that the bacteria is still the bacteria, and yet the human being is expressing itself as a human being. You know?
I just wanted to, the point that you made about Darwin was something I wanted to touch upon, just that idea that you were saying about, competition. And I read a book recently that I've got it here, actually got a copy of it here. It's called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. And the idea behind it is he's trying to take an optimistic view of who we are as a species, as humanity. And I just, the point you made about Darwin reminded me of a bit in here that I wanted to mention in our conversation today. And the line from the book is that the doctrine that humans are innately selfish has a hallowed tradition in Western canon. And then he goes on to mention, great thinkers like Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Luther, Calvin, Burke, Bentham, Nietzsche, Freud, all of them, the American founding fathers, they all had this underlying principle that effectively we're innately selfish, we're in competition, and then you come and bring, Darwin's theory of evolution sort of got put on top of that, and that idea that that we are selfish, we are constantly competing, and a quote from Machiavelli here is that for this can be said of men in general that they are ungrateful, fickle hypocrites. But these are the people upon whom the societal systems that we function on are based, and this book does challenge that. It's taking on the idea that as human beings we don't have to fall back to that default. But when you talk about systems and you talk about the complexity of interactions, it's often said that humans, we're a social animal. And I think living through the pandemic that we've lived through for the last couple of years, that idea of us as a connected people and the fact that we are built from our connections has become, I think, even more tangible. And I wondered if there's something you'd like to speak to about applying the idea of complex adaptive systems, complexity science, to things that are rooted in us as a society, things such as how we interact as a society, things such as building businesses based on social enterprise rather than based on pure competition. I just wondered if there was something that you could put in context for us in that sphere.
Yeah. First of all, if we, again, back to the Darwinian evolution idea, in that, survival is king, right? So force becomes king. And in that worldview, art, creativity, music, song, even community has no space. It is the decoration or the need for decoration is seen as entirely, one could say, random and useless, right? And to your question about how we have designed our organizations, our business structures, we have done it like that. We have said that businesses compete with businesses for survival. Yeah. And whoever survives is the winner. But we forget that when two businesses compete and they fight with each other, there is real human loss. If one company dies, it loses all its employee base. That is incredibly devastating to the people themselves. Yeah. And at the same time, we need to recognize that the business and money itself is a human invention. It's not a natural thing. It's a human invention that was created by humans for the purpose of humans. So then if the endeavor itself is designed in such a way as to destroy humans, one has to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? Are we not looking at the wrong models? You know? In addition, one more layer to this. If in a world, art, music, community is purely decorative, what role do women have then? What role are women playing? And what role is the beauty? What role does beauty play, especially women as expressing beauty play? And we realize that's defined as pure indulgence and unnecessary to evolution. So then this puts women into a secondary, brutal kind of a framework. It places us not in the pathway of evolution at all, except as a womb that produces the next generation. See? So it takes women's, you could say a woman's entire psyche, her entire mind and heart, and says it is nothing. So these are very large statements that were made simply because we looked at evolution in such a narrow and brutish way. Yeah.
Yeah. And, the idea of making quite simplistic boxes to fit things into. This is useful, this is not useful. Men sit in this, women sit in this. This is how money works, this is how business works. How do we move away from that? How do we apply this whole concept of complexity science, of systems, and move away from these ideas where it's such a controlling stance to take, that these things fit into these boxes. We're all in competition with each other. You serve this purpose, you serve that purpose, without seeing the system as a whole. How do we move away from that? How do we use this novel way of thinking about the system and change those established ways of doing things?
Yeah. So first, I'd like to say that complexity science is not novel in the sense that it is trying it is trying to reflect the universe as it is, rather than as we imagine it to be. So in that sense, it's not novel. But
maybe I should say
science as a framework is new.
Yeah, like as being seen as kind of a scientific field now, being particularly in the Western world now, having this definition of a term and what it means. I guess that's what I mean by new or novel.
So a really key point here, and I'm going to quote Fritjof Capra, whom you interviewed yesterday, here, that a system's boundary is porous. The purpose of the boundary is not protection. So again, this is not Darwinian evolution, but the porous boundary is created in order to create identity for the agent itself. So you could say that it is like a home where the child can grow safely, but it is not a home without windows and without doors. There's a constant inflow, outflow of information where the child is exposed to that information, but is growing with the exposure. Now, the child is not just receiving, it is also giving out information. So the actual building of each agent, the actual survival of the agent is actually through that porosity. The exchange of information is necessary for the evolution of each agent, while the boundary is necessary for it to allow the information to structure or create the internal structures that make the agent. See? So the boundary is no longer me against you. The boundary is simply describing the role that I play within the entire system. Now, I've used the word agent quite a bit here, but I'd like to say there is no such thing as sort of a core atom or a core cell over which everything else is built, because each agent is a system as well. So no matter how far down you go, what you see is porous boundaries interacting in community, in network environments, creating something bigger while expressing itself as well. So this completely changes the way we can define how a business sits in community, sits in society itself. Yeah, we now then start to think in terms of what role does business play? What role does money play? Yeah. This, so those of you who are afraid that this kind of thinking means that we can no longer will have profit, that's not true at all. Because within your role, you could be extremely profitable. But the difference being that you acknowledge the necessary information that flows in and out of your role, and acknowledge that, and acknowledge the influence that you have to that inflow and outflow, which right away leads us to the idea of impact and externalities. Today, businesses define themselves by saying, I am not responsible with the externalities that I create. And that's the current definition. And we're trying so hard in the new way of doing business, in the new way of defining economics, in fact, where we're saying, no, the externalities have to be included, but then that is being seen as a damping effect on profits and a regulatory or a regulation that is, you could say it is reducing the energy of the business itself. But that is simply a model that we have created. All we need to do is switch the model. Yeah. To extend that just a bit further, it changes. See, this changes the way we can look at government versus business. So at the moment, capitalism sees government as a regulatory agency that is, something you've got to put up with, really, and you try your best to avoid them, kind of like taxation, right? You try to get away with as much as you can. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways you get away with this is you weaken government. You weaken the people who are in it, you weaken the policies, and you weaken the reach of government itself. But what if the government's role is to ensure the porosity of boundaries, to ensure information flow? What if the government's role is to look at what is created within the commons, and those are the areas between businesses, and to see what is happening in the commons, which then will define what effects it will create on the people who are living in the commons. We are all living in the commons, especially women and children. Yeah. And by not having a definition of the commons, we are forced to fight against businesses. Yeah. So here I'm going to also bring up a very important feature of complex adaptive systems, and this is emergent properties. So I've mentioned a few times that the higher level system shows properties that don't exist in the lower level system. So a water has a liquid property. The liquid property is an emergent property of water at a higher level, at a connected level. Yeah. The emergent properties are what affect the commons. And because our approach, our scientific and theoretical approach is reductionistic, so we don't see emergent properties at all. And then we are surprised why the commons are behaving the way they are, why they're being depleted, for example. Why is water being depleted? Why is nature being depleted? Because we have no way of looking at it. We have no way of fitting it in within the entire process of business itself. Yeah. So it's the emergent properties, transition points, also known as tipping points, networks. These are three of the most important features of complex adaptive systems that did not have a space in the older science, and therefore don't have currently a space in the strategic thinking, in the design thinking that we do in every space today, including medicine.
I know that you've mentioned this, that really it's not a novel idea. It's not a new idea. It's just something that's been given a new wrapper, as it were, particularly here in the West. And so I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about complexity science as a bridge between
Yeah.
perhaps ancient and Eastern sciences or thought approaches and what we now treat as the norm that comes from Western science and Western approaches, and how forming that bridge between the two can give us new solutions for society.
Mm. So my work is in trying to find models of application for complex adaptive systems in every area. But I realized that in Eastern medicine systems, specifically Chinese and Indian, they have approached medicine, healing, and the human body as a complex adaptive system for thousands of years. So they have developed models on how to view, analyze, measure, and heal or intervene with the human body, such as to be complex adaptive system aware. Let's put it that way. So my work is to try and see how they have approached it, what models they have used, and then to take those models and apply them in social enterprises such as that are climate focused, for example, or water focused, and particularly in the area of finance, which we're calling regenerative finance. So certainly in what's called biomedicine these days, or the current model of medicine that come from the West, which is highly reductionistic, which tears the body into pieces in order to understand it, but doesn't know how to deal with so-called such things as chronic illnesses, because chronic illnesses are often not due to a virus or a bacteria, but due to the way things are maladjusted within themselves, where the network itself has a maladjustment to it. So it's not, again, an external bacteria or virus that comes in and causes a disease. So how can we then take biomedicine and apply these complexity models in order to take it forward towards a healing system that can deal with, for example, chronic issues, which are the vast majority of issues that we experience. But similarly, how can complexity science become a language that not only learns from biomedicine, but also from Eastern medicines, and then allows them to move forward in this world that we live in today? So for example, Ayurveda, I have used most recently Ayurveda to treat the side effects of COVID vaccination, and it was extremely successful at it. What the important thing to note here is that the system did not do any kind of root causal analysis on the COVID virus itself, and yet was able to, quote, fix the problem. And that's what's critical here. The healing doesn't come through the medical intervention. Healing is when the medical intervention combined with the self-organization that the body goes through, when these two combine in the correct or the right direction, causes healing. And yet biomedicine doesn't look at self-organization at all. At all. Even an aspirin, when we take an aspirin, the cells in our body respond to this intervention, respond to this perturbation by making a choice in which direction it wants to change. So this is called self-organization. It is a cognitive process of responding to an intervention or responding to new information and moving in a certain direction. What the medical system wants to achieve is to ensure that the direction that it moves into is the direction of healing, not in the direction of getting worse. Yeah. So in defining that, we then immediately say that we must understand the context within which the medicine is applied. And that context is a complex adaptive system. It contains tipping points. It contains emergent properties. It contains self-organization. So we must understand these properties in order to correctly define a medical system. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. And I think it's really interesting you talking about it in those terms, particularly as I say, another thing that we've all become much more aware of in the last couple of years living through this pandemic is what health means and what health means to all of us in different ways. And I think, maybe it is a sign to be optimistic about, that you start to hear people talking now about their health moving in the direction of thinking more holistically. I think they're, until relatively recently, the idea of physical health and mental health were two very separate things. And now you hear them being spoken about, much more as an integrated system of health. You shouldn't think about mental health in one box and physical health in the other. They're integrated, they work together. And now that those conversations are happening, I guess maybe there's optimism that things are moving in the right way. And again, actually, it's interesting in yesterday's event, which again I'll encourage our viewers to go back and watch if they haven't had a chance to do it. There was a conversation about the concept of removing that divide between mind and matter, and I think that again speaks to the idea of thinking about our health and the idea of medicine more holistically. And it is, I think, it's very interesting also, you talking about this idea of understanding a system and the response and the fact that it's complex and it's adaptive. I can see parallels between actually something that seems very cutting edge and modern, and on the kind of molecular level, genetic level, it is, it's a cutting edge new thing, but the idea of personalized medicine and the fact that you designing therapies based on an individual, which is fantastic that we can do it in the way that we can do it now with new technology. But that idea that you should base the treatment on the complexities of that individual rather than just being able to have a blanket approach. I feel that kind of fits with what you're saying as well about the need to understand how the system works before you intervene with it. And that's when you'll have the maximum effect.
Yeah. Entirely. And you're absolutely right that personalized medicine is a natural outcome of this way of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's wonderful to know that. Isn't it also wonderful to know that each individual gets counted? You can say that each individual now gets heard.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we all want at the end of the day? Yeah. To know that we have a space in this world that we.
Yeah, absolutely.
So each individual as a human, but think about it, if we take this thought down to every level, each atom is being heard, is being acknowledged for the role that it plays. It's wonderful. Yeah. So I call complexity science the science of maturity, because it can imagine you're a child and really all you care about maybe is 1 + 1. So it covers that. Then as you grow older, you start seeing connections between people. And as a teenager, your first idea is, I want to express myself and just myself. So you can do that. Then as you grow older, you start caring for children, perhaps. And then as you grow even older, you start seeing a layer of consciousness, a layer above humanity itself, where there's an integration between nature and humanity, and complexity includes that as well. So complexity science has now brought consciousness into its study. The big word that was, you could say was a persona non grata in scientific study until now. So I see complexity science as the science that you can take with you from birth to all the way.
That's a nice way of looking at it. And actually, you mentioned children just there. And I wondered if you had any comments on the idea of how we can apply complexity science when we think about educating children, when we think about the education systems, because, I know it'll be different all around the world, but there's certainly been conversations here in the UK that I hear from parents, I hear from teachers about, are we compartmentalizing education too much, and are we taking away the creative aspects of education? Have we just become about getting children to pass exams now and get certain grades? I wonder what your thoughts are on how we can take this approach and have a new way of looking at how we educate children in society.
Yeah. So I'll start with my own experience as an engineer. I noticed when I was going through engineering school that there were long periods of time in which I would not understand what was being taught. It was just something that was hitting me, and maybe I could repeat it by rote, but that's all I could do. And then if I allowed myself a downtime, just walking, gardening, something like that, there would be a click. And when that click happened, everything I had learned before would make sense. And now I not only knew it, I was master of it. But what was that click? So recently I read an article about the sand pile model of the mind, which comes closest to explaining my experience of this. So the sand pile, the idea is that if you're dropping grains of sand, say on a table, they drop on top of each other, they start to form a cone, a shape. Yeah. There comes a point at which the one grain of sand causes this large movement and the pile collapses. Yeah. And then, of course, it continues and builds up again and again. So that collapse is called a tipping point. It is a point of reorganization when the latest piece of information is sufficient to cause a large change, a large self-organization within the system itself, such that the information reorganizes the structure of the system. And that's what happened to me, that when I was in my downtime, the information that had come in restructured itself until it formed a picture that made me understand all of a sudden and all in completeness the entire topic. So it wasn't no longer 1 + 1 = 2, therefore 1 × 1 = 1, and so on. The whole thing made sense all of a sudden. Yeah. So learning is a response to perturbation, to information coming in, but it is the restructuring within myself that's actual learning. The teaching is simply information. Teaching does not cause learning without the reorganization that happens within the mind. So if we really want students to learn, not just to be taught, but to learn, then we need to accommodate that tipping point, that self-organization, which right away means we need to accommodate downtime. We need to accommodate that space. So some of first of all, I don't know why education has come to this point where we think of children as these little boxes that you open the top of the box and you pour information in, and we expect the child to learn from there. But that's not learning. That's simply filling a bucket. Yeah. But right away, we see that our focus now shifts. It shifts from content to the reception of the content, the receptivity, the ability to receive the content. This is a completely different approach to understanding how education happens. Yeah? Today, the child that sits quietly in class is the good student. So we are saying that the child that denies his own self-organization is the good student, rather than the one who does. So is it any wonder that the most creative kids hate school? You know? So, but you brought up the word creation or creativity, and I'd like to take that back to a complex adaptive system type of understanding. So when a complex adaptive system receives new information, as I mentioned, you could say it messes with it. It tries to make sense with it based on the current structure it has. So it takes what it knows, takes the new information coming in, builds something new out of it. It's called sense making. That sense making is an act of creation. It's an act of creativity. So we are required by the universe to commit an act of creation at every moment. We are not supposed to resurrect the past. We are not supposed to copy the past. We are supposed to take the tools that have come about from the past. Note that I'm not saying copying the past, just the tools, our structures, our understanding that have come from the past, take the new information and commit an act of creation. So creativity is the norm. Unlike our current understanding, even in business, what is it we're supposed to do in business? We're supposed to manage. The idea of management is the idea of control. But what is the reason that we want to control? Because we are trying to get the business to go in a certain direction, yeah? Whatever that direction may be. And we think the way to get it to go in that direction is through forcing and controlling it. It's sort of like building concrete walls along the edges of a river and saying, we have now controlled the river and it's going in the direction that we have wanted to go. And in so doing, we have lost everything that the river picked up on its edges. You know, river has its identity, picking it up along the way, including we build identity not just based on what we receive, it's also based on what we give. And we have lost all of that.
And that river analogy is such a great analogy there, because you put concrete walls down, and yes, you've completely directed where it needs to go, but all of that interaction that is happening between the river and the riverbank has gone, and that's what that's giving to the river, and what the river's giving to the riverbank has just been taken away. That's a wonderful analogy. I'm going to remember that for the future. I think I like that a lot.
Add to that, you brought up the pandemic a few times. We have learned that resilience is what's needed, yeah? Think about the loss of resilience when we build concrete walls to a river. Yes, we have achieved endpoint goals. Like take it from point A to point, we've got that. We've got it down. But when the endpoint is wrong, as we see in the pandemic, or let's say the endpoint suddenly gets closed, what do we do now? The entire resilience that the river naturally had of redirecting itself is now lost. Yeah. Our resilience comes from our sensing of the current situation and our response given what we have, the tools that we have. That's resilience. And yet we are not encouraging it, we're not teaching it, we're not growing it in any way. And because we're not aware of it ourselves, it naturally gets weakened. It atrophies, just like if you don't use your left arm, it atrophies, right?
Yeah, it's I don't know if there are any educators watching, but I think there's a lot to be said there about how we can think about things differently. You talked about earlier on about creating change and having impact in whatever sphere the complexity science is being applied. And so I just wanted to expand on that a little bit in terms of just that view of what impact means.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about something from the complexity science perspective, how do we think about then impact for society, or even impact for the business you're working with, or impact for that environmental issue that you're working on? What does impact mean when you're looking at it from this complexity science perspective? Let me take an example. An environmental intervention. We all know climate change is a big issue. We're all trying to do what we can to make the situation better. If there's an intervention taking place to try and mitigate climate change and support the environment, from the complexity science perspective, how do we measure the impact that that is having?
Yeah. So measurement is one of the big challenges of impact, but I'll step back just a bit. So impact businesses, also known as social enterprises. So they started off with the idea, well, we know how to do business. We've been doing business for a long time. So why don't we just redirect the mission of business from pure profit to impact? But impact, theoretically, is a completely different thing than, say, introducing a product in the market. Let's say I have a brand new widget, a new smartphone that I want to introduce. In large, all I really care is that people buy it. Right? That's what I do. That's all I really care about. Impact, on the other hand, whether it's climate change or it's for social good, like social equity, gender equity, wealth equity, cannot be forced. It can't even be managed. It can only be allowed. You cannot force gender equality, right? You can only create the conditions in which it can happen. So impact, in a lot of ways, is the opposite of what business strategy so far has understood. So we need a new theory for impact businesses, and that's where complexity science comes in. So complexity science can go in and brings its theories of self-organizations, its theory of self-expression, its theories of porous boundaries, and say, this is how you need to design yourself. And what's interesting about this is while it's designing the success of impact, it is by default designing the success of the business as well, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have to think of the two as being at cross purposes, which is what's happening today on Wall Street. We don't have to think of them at that. What we need is a new theory to understand how to produce impact or how to produce successful impact. Not a new theory to say, we don't want profits out of it. Yeah. Right? That's the way we're currently thinking about it. Now, impact is happening regardless. Even those folks who are putting a new product out in the market, they're having an impact because it's human beings that are buying that product. The minute you have human beings, you're creating social impact, period. It's just that we refuse to look at it. I mean, consider the smartphone. It has completely changed child psychology. It has changed the way children come to school, the expectations, how they think. It has changed parenting. Yeah. But who's responsible for that change? Who has to deal with it? Right? Certainly not the companies that put out the smartphones.
No, exactly. You know, I think related to that, I think it fits quite nicely. We've had a question come in, and about that, really, about how you can shape businesses, how you can shape organizations differently. And the question is that it's about the idea of Vedanta, as it's a core philosophical system from India. And at the root of it, the person who sent the question in says, it's inherently based on whole systems thinking. So how can something like Vedanta, which is, whole systems thinking, exactly what you're talking about, and complexity, how can that gain more of a leading role in shaping our institutions? How do we make that happen?
So I was, the push towards diversity these days, and especially what's called neurodiversity, right? Create teams with neurodiversity in them. But the way they're approaching neurodiversity is, again, extractive, in the sense that if I have a team of diverse thinkers, I can get more ideas and more innovation, therefore make more profit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If we just switch that way of thinking a little bit and said, every diverse thinker inputs to the whole a different angle. So let's say a different color. Yeah. So each person comes in, they put a splash of color into the whole, and each one comes in with a different color. The aggregate color of the team or of the innovation of the company changes based on the proportions of each of these inputs. So note, I'm not saying I am aiming for a single color. That's not what I'm saying. Nor am I saying that we want to eliminate certain colors. What I'm saying is the combining of all these colors creates an aggregate color, which may be what we're interested in. Yeah. So where whole systems thinking comes in is we need to think more in terms of neither top down nor bottom up, right? More in terms of emergent properties that come through the interplay of everybody there. Yeah. So you talk about Vedanta. So my favorite Ayurvedic teacher, he said, never mess with a person's individuality. And this is a medical doctor. So what this is saying is that each individual has a role to play. Their role contributes to the whole. If they don't play that role because you have told them that they're bad or their role is not important, the whole diminishes. The whole cannot be without that role. And that's the kind of thinking we need to have. Not diversity for the sake of diversity, not diversity because it creates more profit, but because diversity is the whole.
You know, it's so fascinating what you said, that you shouldn't change the individual and that everyone's splash of color is different, because anybody who's ever joined an office, an organization, what's the first thing that happens when you go in? This is who we are as an organization, as a company. Right. This is our culture. These are our values. Here's your induction. This is how you have to behave. Up until the point at which people were still widely going into offices, before things changed for us. This is how we dress. This is how we do things. This is how, this is the language that we use when we communicate. It's the complete opposite, isn't it? You go into an institution and they instantly tell you everything you need to change about yourself to fit in. But it is incredible to think about, what if we flipped that? What if we just looked at that person and thought, okay, they as an individual, with all their individuality, they're coming in and becoming a part of this system. And now how does this system adjust, adapt, and become the best it can be now that this new person has come in? I think that's fascinating. And I think it's almost shocking in its simplicity that we do it so badly, and it's so much the norm to do the opposite. I can't quite believe I'm saying this because it's flown by, but we're almost getting to the end of the hour that we have together. And there was just one more thing I wanted to touch upon, is that I believe that you're going to be presenting at the International Conference on Systems Thinking and Women's Empowerment.
Yes.
That's coming up. Mm-hmm. I just wondered if you could just take the last section of time that we have, last few minutes, to tell us more about the application of complexity science and systems thinking in this context, in the context of women's empowerment, and if there's anything that you might be able to just tease us with in terms of what you'll be presenting at the conference.
Very good. Okay, so we are, my colleague and I, we are presenting a paper, and we have taken women's empowerment in the broadest sense, and that is where complexity science comes in. So we go out there and we talk about structure and process, which in traditional systems, Indian and Chinese, structure is female, yin, and process is masculine, yang. Yeah, or in the Indian system, Shiva and Shakti. Okay? So they're considered, the pairing of yin yang is considered to be the essential foundational dynamic of the universe. The only time the two can be separated or are separated is at death. So the two go together at all times. So what the point we're making in biomedicine is that the reductionism of biomedicine routinely removes the yin, the female aspect. And in so doing, it is unable to understand context, it is unable to understand healing, and unable to understand the precursors of disease. And that's really critically important as we talk more and more about prevention. But prevention means recognizing the precursor of disease and how the precursor of disease doesn't show up as a muscular pain necessarily or a twisted muscle. What does it show up as then? Right? In a system that is so interconnected and touching anything touches everything else, what exactly is a precursor to disease? And the point we're trying to make is that the yin aspect is half of that so-called problem. Right.
Fascinating. It sounds really interesting. And once again, I never would have thought about thinking in that way about that particular problem. I think, I could talk to you for several hours more, but we are coming to the end of the hour that we have together. If people are interested in keeping up to date with what you're working on and with the field of complexity science more generally, where can you point us?
So there are very accessible to the beginner videos, short 10-minute sort of videos, and on a channel called Systems Innovation on YouTube. So go there. I'm also part of that group. As for my work, I am trying to start a blog, a little bit unsure about that. And the work in biomedicine, we have a group called Complexity Medicine. We have a presence on LinkedIn. So follow that. And we will point you to all of our latest conferences and papers and so on over there. So, and of course, you can reach out to me via LinkedIn.
Fantastic. I hope people will reach out through all those channels and keep up to date. I've certainly found it fascinating to learn more about the field, about what you're doing. I hope it's not the last time that we'll speak and be able to have you involved in something that we're doing. Just to remind everybody who's watching, if you missed yesterday's event, Think Differently, then you can find a link on the YouTube channel. And please do come back and see what content that we have for you in the future. I'd just like to give a final thanks to today's guest, Tanuja Prasad. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you for the last hour or so. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.